Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, right after the end of the spring semester and in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Since we do not yet know for sure what format our classes will take in the fall, and since there's some likelihood that at least some of us, both students and faculty, will have to be away from campus for a time should the mitigation plans prove ineffective, or should compliance with or enforcement of public health guidelines prove impossible, I am preparing a video version of each of my lectures for the class to have it ready if and when it is needed. It's also the case that necessary distancing requirements in the classrooms may make it impossible that the entire class can be in the same room at the same time. In that case, those whose turn it is to stay away from campus may find these video lectures a better option than relying on a live classroom feed via Zoom or some other technology. So if you're watching this video, it means that we are, for reasons of public and personal health, still unable to meet together in a traditional face-to-face classroom format. All the same, I'll continue to do my best to teach you what I know with whatever tools I have at my disposal. Enjoy the lecture. So now we turn to Ralph Waldo Emerson's American Scholar from 1837. This was an address that Emerson delivered to the Phi Beta Kappa Society at Harvard College. Emerson was a Harvard graduate and was invited back to address the beginning of the new academic year. And you'll see as we undertake study of this particular address that it is remarkably different in a lot of ways than any of the speeches we have read so far. So Ralph Waldo Emerson was born in Boston on the 25th of May, 1803. He attended Boston Latin School and then graduated from Harvard College in 1821. He went on to the Harvard Divinity School and took his divinity degree in 1824, and in 1829 married his first wife, Ellen Tucker, who died of tuberculosis only 2 years later. Ellen Tucker was from Concord, New Hampshire. In 1829, he was also ordained as the junior minister for Boston's Second Church, but it was only a short time after that Emerson grew disillusioned with the ordained ministry. He had some disagreements with the doctrinal commitments of the church, and so left the ministry and moved to Concord, Massachusetts. As we mentioned, his first wife had died in 1831. In 1835, he remarries Lydia Jackson, and the following year publishes one of his most famous essays, Nature. And that same year, he began to meet with the Transcendental Club, which he helped to found. This was a regular meeting of intellectuals in the greater Boston area, including some well-known political figures, philosophers, literary lights, and the like. And out of this, Emerson develops his philosophy of transcendentalism, which is a kind of thinking about the world or experiencing of the world that looks all the time for inspiration from nature, inspiration from the divine, ways of experiencing the world and always looking for the truth that is being revealed in a particular moment. And then, of course, the following year, he delivers the address that is the object of our study today. That is the Phi Beta Kappa Address, American Scholar, at Harvard College. In that same year, he met Henry David Thoreau, with whom he maintained a long friendship until Thoreau's death. The year after he gives the address at the Phi Beta Kappa Society at Harvard, he's invited to give the Divinity School address. He was again a graduate of the Harvard Divinity School. And much like the American Scholar, the Divinity School address is seen as a kind of radical statement. And so after these two speeches, Emerson isn't invited back to Harvard at all for almost 30 years. Later in his career, he publishes several collections of essays. He became a popular lecturer. He wrote poems and published books of poems. He was an active abolitionist. He came out publicly in opposition to the fugitive slave law in 1851. When his friend Thoreau died, he was asked to give the eulogy. He spent a lot of time traveling. He traveled elsewhere in the United States, down to the South, out to the West. He met John Muir in California. He traveled in Europe. And he died in Concord, Massachusetts in 1882. So let's take a look at this academic address, The American Scholar. And that brings to mind right away the first question about the genre. We know that Emerson is speaking at the opening of the academic year. The date of the address is the 31st of August, which, as it turns out, is the same date of the beginning of our academic year this fall. And so this was a tradition that Phi Beta Kappa would mark the opening of the academic year by inviting some noteworthy poet or politician or writer to come and give a speech. And so they invite Emerson, and he's responding to that occasion. So in its general sense, we would say this is an epideictic speech because Emerson is marking a particular civic occasion, and the themes are associated in some ways with epideictic topics. But in another way, we can also see the influence of Emerson's training as a minister, because the address has certain qualities that remind us of a sermon almost. It's not at all focused on the topic of religion, but in its form and in its attempt to get members of the audience to reflect on their lives. In that sense, it has a kind of ministerial function. So then we can ask about the rhetorical situation, the exigence, the audience, and the constraints. And if we think about the exigence, we get a sense of this from the speech itself. Certainly, there is an occasional exigence, that is, a particular sort of occasion like this requires a certain kind of speech, that we need to formally mark the beginning of the academic year, and so that's one of the tasks that Emerson has. But at the same time, we get a sense from the speech that Emerson is disillusioned about the state of institutional education in America, and in particular, higher education, college education. And so he sees a kind of crisis in education, and this is an attempt to encourage his audience to reflect on that and maybe to amend their understanding and their action in relation to their own education. And then we ask about the audience, and think about this. This is Emerson, who is an alumnus of Harvard College. He's returning to his alma mater. He's speaking before the Phi Beta Kappa Society, of which he is a member. And so he's invited by what is the most distinguished, the most esteemed educational institution in America. And he's invited to speak to an audience of Harvard students and faculty and administrators. So all of them are expecting a certain kind of address that goes along with the tradition of a Harvard education or American institutional education in general. So it's safe to say that Emerson's address is going to be a bit of a surprise, to say the least, to this distinguished Harvard audience. But we can also, again, because Emerson had an awareness of his own position in society as a poet, as a lecturer, as a writer, that he no doubt understood that his words would be circulated beyond the immediate audience of the Phi Beta Kappa Society and the Harvard faculty. And so we can see as well that he intends to address that wider audience, especially that wider audience of sort of intellectually minded people who might take seriously his reflections on literature, education, and the life of the mind. So what are the constraints? Well, it's interesting to talk about constraints in connection with the Emerson speech, because one of the interesting things about the speech is there's no question about the fact that Emerson is aware of the constraints. Those would be both the generic or situational constraints and also the sort of ideological or content level artistic constraints. That is, he knows very well what he's expected to say, and he probably is quite aware of the tradition of this kind of oration given to the Phi Beta Kappa Society at the beginning of an academic year. And yet, even being aware of all of those constraints, it's very clear that Emerson, in large measure, ignores most of them and gives the kind of speech that nobody expected. So in some sense, then, the constraints that are really important here are the constraints that Emerson places on himself. That is to say, he aims to be true to his own calling rather than respond to the demands of the immediate situation. And you'll see that he talks about this, in fact, not directly with regard to the speech he's given, but more generally about the life of the scholar, that he talks about this in the address. So here are some of the critical questions we can ask about Emerson's American Scholar Address. How might the address be read as a political manifesto? What are the politics of the address? And is this a radical speech? Is it radical even for our own day? Now, we've hinted at this already, but I want you to look as you're reading through the speech, look for those places where he's obviously transgressing expectations. And in that sense, especially in regard to the content of the address, look for those places where he's obviously challenging the prevailing ideology and the presumptions about the importance of institutional education as he speaks to the audience at Harvard. So in that sense, we can see that at least in the content of his message, there's a clear radical impulse there, which in some ways we would even consider radical in our own day. What is less obvious is that radical politics or the content of the radical message does not translate into the form of the oration. There are certain ways in which Emerson is a little freer or more liberal with the form of the speech, but he still adheres to certain expectations regarding oratorical propriety. And so one of the questions, again, we can maybe add on to this question, the way in which the form and the content of the speech either work together or in some ways work against one another, because it is in its content a radical message, but in its form still conforms to some of the generic expectations of the occasion. And then we can ask, what qualities of the speech are consistent with Emerson's transcendentalist philosophy? So again, as we mentioned briefly before, this transcendental philosophy, which is a kind of a new American philosophy and one which Emerson is largely credited for establishing, suggests that what matters most in our understanding of the universe is subjective experience. There's a kind of romanticism associated with the emotional response to the universe. And so truth is very much rooted in individualism, in the individual experience of the person in the universe or in nature. And the other side of that, of course, is the transcendentalists saw organized society, institutions, organized religion, and the like as suppressing the wonder of the individual and the individual's subjective instinct. Another aspect of transcendentalism that's quite important is nature itself. It's from nature that the truth of the universe is revealed to the individual. So it's that revelation of the natural world, which has not merely philosophical implications, but of course, especially religious implications as well. So, for instance, as Emerson said in his essay on nature, in the woods we return to reason and faith. There I feel nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. It's also perhaps worth pointing out that what we think of as the modern environmental movement has many of its roots in the original transcendental connections to nature. So we can think of, for instance, Henry David Thoreau's, the friend and associate of Emerson, Thoreau's book Walden, in which he writes about the way in which human beings can experience nature and the impositions on the natural landscape of modern, especially industrial developments. So, what are the qualities of the speech that are consistent with Emerson's transcendentalist philosophy? I think you'll see this especially in some of the critiques of institutional education, especially higher education, of some of the traditions, the societal traditions that have built up and which, as Emerson would suggest, are suppressing the wonder and instinct of the individual scholar, that they need to be liberated from some of those institutional constraints to become what he calls man thinking. We could ask as well, in what sense can the speech be read as a sort of confession or even apologia of Emerson's own life and intellectual pursuits? So how is the speech, in other words, autobiographical? And I think you'll find that there are clearly some passages that relate to that, which demonstrate or reveal things that Emerson himself has experienced or is thinking about in connection with his own life, and which he is sharing with the members of his audience. And certainly one of the points made in the article that I've asked you to read is that so much of what ends up in the American Scholar is the result of Emerson's reflections on his own experience and things that have been written in his journal over the previous 4 or 5 years. Then why is it ironic that we are reading Emerson's Address in a course on great speakers and speeches? So if you've read through the address, or when you do, one of the things you'll find is his remarks on books and how books are the most useful things when used well and the worst of things when used poorly or wrongly. And so in that regard, it's somewhat ironic because Emerson is asking each individual scholar to go out and experience the world on his or her own and to not rely simply on the wisdom of books or the wisdom of past scholars. And yet here we are, in some ways, institutionalizing Emerson by making him part of the canon of great American oratory, something that I think would suggest to him that we had ignored the message of the American scholar. And then finally, can you extract or digest an implicit rhetorical theory from Emerson's address and philosophy? And how is that idea of rhetoric different than classical rhetorical theory? And we'll talk about this as we get to that particular passage in the address, but there are clearly places in the speech where Emerson has reflected on his own task of having to speak to an audience and what he has learned from his own sort of transcendental or individual reflections, and what that tells him about what an orator needs to do to reach an audience and to be persuasive. not persuasive in the sense of convincing an audience to accept something that they don't believe themselves, but as a way of discovering and sharing the truth that will resonate deeply with the audience you are addressing. So then let's take a look at some of the observations in the article by Merton Seltz. Now, this is one of several very good critical and historical studies of the American Scholar by Emerson, but it's one that focuses in particular on the sort of autobiographical aspects of the speech. And so I thought it would be a good way to sort of get into that particular question, to have you look at what Seltz had to say. Well, first, toward the very end of the article, he gives us a good summary. So I want to start with that summary from toward the end, because as he suggests, in composing his oration in terms of these guiding ideas, Emerson quite clearly went back to the earlier formulation in his journals and lectures. More than a third of the American Scholar is directly traceable to journal and lecture passages taken over with relatively slight revision or rearrangement, some of them written as early as 1834 and others drafted during the summer of 1837 after acceptance of the invitation from Phi Beta Kappa. And so the point here is that Emerson is not merely responding just to that invitation or to the immediate occasion, but he's been thinking about these questions for a long time and uses this opportunity to share some of those individual reflections with a willing audience. Then, at the beginning of the article, Seltz introduces this idea. More specifically, the oration on the scholar grew organically out of thinking recorded in the journal during the middle 1830s. He says the oration is an essay in definition of that role, that is, the American Scholar, as it appeared to him in 1837. So Seltz describes Emerson's Address. The oration of 1837 is more than an exercise in literary nationalism, though it has been so described, as it is more than a conventional speech for commencement time. Its roots lie too deep within Emerson's troubled thinking about his own role as a scholar. So, again, we want to look at the clear autobiographical dimensions of this speech, in addition to what Emerson is trying to say to the students of Harvard College. As Seltz explains, for Emerson in the mid-1830s, defining his self-appointed role of scholar meant working out in actual practice and in words the questions posed when he gave up his pastoral duties in 1832. Who is the scholar, and what does he do and say? For whom and to whom does he speak? And so again, the American Scholar Address is the result of a long period of thinking about these questions by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Further on in the article, Seltz observes that the journeyman writer, thinking only to sing to the tune of the times, to be the decorous sayer of smooth things to lull the ear of society, must lay aside all hope to wield or so much as to touch the bright thunderbolts of truth which it is given to the true scholar to launch and whose light flashes through ages without diminution. So in this first highlighted passage, you see Seltz quoting from Emerson and his journal, but reflecting on what Emerson calls in the address the need for a kind of literary heroism, to go beyond just the constraints of society. And we see indeed in this address Emerson enacting that very principle. In addition to saying that, he's actually doing it in the speech. And then Seltz goes on to point out that in the journal, Emerson is voicing his own growing aspirations as a writer. In the lecture, however, the now familiar figure of the true scholar gives way to another related idealization, those august geniuses who make up the body of English literature. So if Emerson aspires to that, if he wants to be not just a true scholar, but indeed a literary genius, what does that require? As Seltz observes down the bottom of this passage here, right? Instinctive belief that the office of the great genius was to guide the future, not to follow the past. Again, quoting from Emerson's journal. And so the key thing here is breaking out of the constraints of tradition and institutional education to get beyond what is just the traditions of the past and the books, and to be inspired individually and have that experience of the universe as the source of your truth and your writing. Then Seltz observes in another section, the most conspicuous movement of Emerson's mind in the middle 1830s is away from primary concern with institutions and works of the past in favor of creation in the present with an eye to the future. So again, emphasizing that importance of experiencing things for yourself, being inspired by the present, by your surroundings, by the universe, and writing about that, finding your truth there, and thinking about then what that can teach those of the future. Emerson's repeated insistence on originality and creativity is concurrent with his emergence as an independent thinker, writer, and public speaker, known for his own distinctive style and voice, confident in his own insight. And so here we want to think about these observations by Seltz because they reflect on things that we'll read in The American Scholar, especially those things that Emerson has to say about books and how books are both used well but also misused. He goes on to say, the American Scholar itself is Emerson's desire not only to transcend the world of common life, but to transform it, not politically, but by spiritual arms alone. His primary objective was to ennoble individual men. Progress, he declared in his lectures on the philosophy of history, is not for society. Progress belongs to the individual. And so there we see again this emergence in Emerson's journals and also in the address of those transcendental themes. So again, turning to Emerson's journals, we see him reflecting on the task before him as he approaches that occasion of speaking to the Phi Beta Kappa Society. The hope to arouse young men at Cambridge to a worthier view of their literary duties teach or prompts me to offer the theory of the scholar's function. He has an office to perform in society. What is it? To arouse the intellect, to keep it erect and sound, to keep admiration in the hearts of the people, to keep the eye open upon its spiritual aims. And so we can judge as we read the speech how well Emerson has accomplished that. So let's take a look then at some of the key passages in The American Scholar. So first, in the introduction, Emerson gives us a clear preview that this is not going to be your grandfather's commencement address. It's not going to be a typical academic speech. Neither is it going to be the kind of address that the members of the Harvard faculty or the administration or even the students would have expected from an alumnus of that institution. Emerson says, perhaps the time is already come when it ought to be and will be something else, when the sluggard intellect of this continent will look from under its iron lids and fill the postponed expectation of the world with something better than the exertions of mechanical skill. Our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands, draws to a close. The millions that around us are rushing into life cannot always be fed on the sere remains of foreign harvests. Events, actions arise that must be sung, that will sing themselves. And so here, Emerson is not very flattering in describing sort of American intellectual or literary life. It is, we have a sluggard intellect on this continent. We have merely an apprenticeship to the learning of other lands. So in some ways, and this is what Seltz referred to, the thinking about Emerson's speech as a kind of intellectual or literary declaration of independence, he's calling for a distinctive American literary tradition that emerges out of what is the uniquely American experience. But then think about how this challenges some of the approach taken at Harvard, which was still very much an institution rooted in classical learning and in the tradition of each class reading the same books as the previous class, and still very much dependent on especially the literature of Europe. And then Emerson moves to a discussion of all the various human faculties and talks about how within society, the mastery of those faculties are divided among individuals. And so he says, in this distribution of functions, the scholar is the delegated intellect. In the right state, he is man thinking. In the degenerate state, when the victim of society, he tends to become a mere thinker, or still worse, the parrot of other men's thinking. So let's stop there for a second. Look at how the scholar can be the victim of society, right? So when the individual is in some ways suppressed by organized society or societal institutions, whether that's a college or organized religion, what he ends up being is not the fulfillment of the intellectual man, that is man thinking, but instead a mere thinker. And think about this in connection with the sort of traditional learning at Harvard. Still worse, the parrot of other men's thinking. And so Emerson then launches into a consideration of who man thinking is, or who the scholar is. He says in a preview, let us see him in his school and consider him in reference to the main influences he receives. So the first of those influences is nature. He says the first in time and the first in importance of the influences upon the mind is that of nature. Every day the sun, and after sunset night and her stars. Ever the winds blow, ever the grass grows. Every day men and women conversing, beholding, and beholden. The scholar is he of all men whom this spectacle most engages. He must settle its value in his mind. What is nature to him? There is never a beginning, there is never an end to the inexplicable continuity of this web of God, but always circular power returning into itself. And so again, we see the influence of that transcendental philosophy, especially the importance of inspiration, almost a kind of romantic inspiration from nature, that this should be the primary influence on a scholar. So again, you think about the sort of elite education of the Harvard student, right? And probably the idea of walking in the woods or being inspired looking up at the stars at night is not what the student or the student's parents are paying tuition for, but it is what Emerson is suggesting should be the primary influence on the scholar. Then he turns to talk about books. He says the next great influence into the spirit of the scholar is the mind of the past, in whatever form, whether of literature, of art, of institutions, that mind is inscribed. And the primary way in which, of course, we experience the mind of the past, he says, is books. And so he continues, the theory of books is noble. The scholar of the first age received into him the world around, brooded thereon, gave it the new arrangement of his own mind, and uttered it again. It came into him life, it went out from him truth. It came to him short-lived actions, it went out from him immortal thoughts. So ideally, this is what a book does. It shares that primary experience from nature, from the world, that the author of the book experienced, right? But as Emerson goes on to point out, this is not typically how books are used, especially at institutions like Harvard. There is instead a grave mischief, he says. Yet hence arises a grave mischief, the sacredness which attaches to the act of creation, the act of thought, is transferred to the record. The poet chanting was felt to be a divine man. Henceforth the chant is divine also. The writer was a just and wise spirit. Henceforward it is settled, the book is perfect, as love of the hero corrupts into worship of his statue. Instantly, the book becomes noxious. The guide is a tyrant. And so what Emerson is doing here is reflecting on sort of that literary tradition, and we're observing it here in this class with a speech on great speakers and speeches, right? Who are we to say to a generation now that these are the great orations and everybody ought to learn them and read them? And Emerson is saying, yes, it's great if you can read books from the past or read the thoughts or philosophy or history or literature from minds from the past. But experience the world yourself. Be original. Be creative. Don't let books be a tyrant. Don't worship the content of books. And as Emerson observes, this tradition of relying on a canon of literature, on relying on the books of the past, is central to educational institutions and to the sort of societal norm for especially higher education. Colleges are built on it, he said. Books are written on it by thinkers, not by man thinking, by men of talent, that is, who start wrong, who set out from accepted dogmas, not from their own sight of principles. Meek young men grow up in libraries, believing it their duty to accept the views which Cicero, which Locke, which Bacon have given, forgetful that Cicero, Locke, and Bacon were only young men in libraries when they wrote these books. Hence, instead of man thinking, Emerson says, we have the bookworm. Books are the best of things well used, abused among the worst. So you can imagine why the Harvard faculty, the Harvard administration thought this was a pretty unwelcome, indeed even a radical statement by Ralph Waldo Emerson, how it clearly transgressed some of the traditions of Harvard and may have been dangerous ideas for the students of Harvard to be hearing, because it challenges the basic foundation on which a Harvard education, and indeed higher education in general in America at the time, was constructed. And then Emerson suggests that another of the great influences on the scholar ought to be action. Action is with the scholar subordinate, but it is essential. Without it, he is not yet man. Without it, thought can never ripen into truth. Whilst the world hangs before the eye as a cloud of beauty, we cannot even see its beauty. Inaction is cowardice, but there can be no scholar without the heroic mind. I do not see how any man can afford, for the sake of his nerves and his nap, to spare any action in which he can partake. It is pearls and rubies to his discourse. Drudgery, calamity, exasperation, want are all instructors in eloquence and wisdom. So from the experience of life, from living in the world, you learn those truths that are fundamental to being the great scholar, the true scholar, the man thinking that Emerson is talking about. And from that experience, you get what he calls the pearls and rubies of your discourse. That action in the world becomes an instructor in eloquence. So he reflects a little further on living in the world. If it were only for a vocabulary, the scholar would be covetous of action. Life is our dictionary. Years are well spent in country labors. in town, in the insight into trades and manufactures, in frank intercourse with many men and women, in science, in art, to the one end of mastering in all their facts a language by which to illustrate and embody our perceptions. I learn immediately from any speaker how much he has already lived through the poverty or the splendor of his speech. Life lies behind us as the quarry from whence we get tiles and copestones for the masonry of today. This is the way to learn grammar. Colleges and books only copy the language which the field and the workyard made. And in connection with living in the world and action, Emerson reflects on the dignity of labor. I hear, therefore, with joy whatever is beginning to be said of the dignity and necessity of labor to every citizen. There is virtue yet in the hoe and the spade for learned as well as for unlearned hands, and labor is everywhere welcome. Always we are invited to work. Only be this limitation observed, that a man shall not, for the sake of wider activity, sacrifice any opinion to the popular judgments and modes of action. So, again, the experience of laboring becomes a source of truth, of knowledge for the true scholar. But we shouldn't be constrained, as he points out in this last line, right? We shouldn't be constrained by the opinion of popular judgments. So again, Emerson is looking for everyone to find their own way, to use their subjective experience to find their way in the world. And then, after reflecting on the influences on the scholar, he turns to the duties of the scholar. I have now spoken of the education of the scholar by nature, by books, and by action. It remains to say somewhat of his duties. They are such as become man-thinking. They may all be comprised in self-trust. The office of the scholar is to cheer, to raise, and to guide men by showing them facts amidst appearances. He plies the slow, unhonored, and unpaid task of observation. And so here, as Emerson begins to reflect on the duties of the scholar, we now get into the portion of the address that is clearly autobiographical. He says in another place, in the long period of his preparation, he must betray often an ignorance and shiftlessness in popular arts, incurring the disdain of the able who shoulder him aside. Long he must stammer in his speech, often forego the living for the dead. Worse yet, he must accept, how often, poverty and solitude. For the ease and pleasure of treading the old road, accepting the fashions, the education, the religion of society, he takes the cross of making his own, and of course the self-accusation, the faint heart, the frequent uncertainty and loss of time, which are the nettles and tangling vines in the way of the self-relying and self-directed, and the state of virtual hostility in which he seems to stand to society, and especially to educated society. So there's no way really to read this except not only as a prescription for the students at Harvard to whom Emerson is speaking, but especially as a reflection on his own experience. He is sharing that experience. These are things that have happened to him. This is how he perceives his own experience, and he's sharing that with his audience. So we can imagine, and if you know something about the life of Emerson, he did have periods of poverty and solitude. He did have periods where society was hostile to him, and especially educated society. As I mentioned, after this and then the Divinity School address the following year, he was basically shunned by Harvard for more than 30 years. And so we see in the American Scholar not only a statement about the state of American education, but indeed an autobiographical revelation by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Then we get to what I consider to be my favorite passage in the address, not only because of its beauty in the style that Emerson chooses, but because I think it still rings very true. It resonates very deeply for understanding our own experience in the world today. As Emerson reflects, the world of any moment is the merest appearance, some great decorum, some fetish of a government, some ephemeral trade or war or man is cried up by half mankind and cried down by the other half, as if all depended on this particular up or down. The odds are that the whole question is not worth the poorest thought which the scholar has lost in listening to the controversy. Let him not quit his belief that a pop gun is a pop gun, though the ancient and honorable of the earth affirm it to be the crack of doom. And so again, you see Emerson transgressing and challenging the received opinion, the traditions, the popular belief, the conventional means of doing things, and suggesting trust yourself. As he says in the previous passage, what matters to the scholar is self-trust. And then we get this passage toward the end of the address where Emerson, who is in the process of giving a speech, who is acting as an orator himself, again in a kind of autobiographical fashion, reflects on the role of the orator or the practice of oratory. He begins by talking about the poet and then moves to the orator. The poet, in utter solitude, remembering his spontaneous thoughts and recording them, is found to have recorded that which men in crowded cities find true for themselves also. The orator distrusts at first the fitness of his frank confessions, his want of knowledge of the person he addresses, until he finds that he is the complement of his hearers, that they drink his words because he fulfills for them their own nature. The deeper he dives into his privatist, secretist presentiment, to his wonder he finds this is the most acceptable, most public, and universally true. The people delight in it. The better part of every man feels, this is my music, this is myself. So again, I think we can see Emerson reflecting on his experience, not only in speaking at Harvard in 1837, but in all of his experience as a public speaker, perhaps beginning with his ministerial duties and his preaching as a minister in Boston, but especially in his experience as a lecturer, where he has shared his reflections with various audiences on a wide range of philosophical and literary topics. So Emerson himself now is sharing what he has learned about addressing an audience, that those things that you think about, that you come to realize are truths from your subjective experience, when you share with an audience, will resonate deeply with them. And so there's our sort of quick review of this remarkable address, Ralph Waldo Emerson's The American Scholar. I hope that you've seen the ways in which it not only challenges the conventions and expectations of that occasion, but how it differs in remarkable ways from many of the orations that we've already read. So if you have any questions or comments on Emerson's American Scholar, please post them to the discussion board.